There is a kind of coincidence that history produces occasionally, and that no novelist would be permitted to invent, because it is too neat and because the reader would refuse it. In the winter of 1613, in a country that had spent 15 years devouring itself, a delegation of tired men rode northeast from Moscow along frozen roads to a monastery standing where two rivers meet. The monastery had been built by a family that no longer mattered and enlarged by a family that had just been destroyed. It was called the Ipatiev Monastery, after a saint, and in a set of rooms inside its walls lived a boy of 16 and his mother, who had taken religious vows under duress and who did not want visitors. The men had come to offer the boy a crown. His name was Mikhail Fyodorovich Romanov. 305 years later, in July of 1918, in a provincial city on the eastern slope of the Ural Mountains, the last man to hold that crown spent his final night in a requisitioned merchant's house behind a high wooden fence. The house had belonged to a military engineer of no historical importance whatever. His surname was Ipatiev. A dynasty that began in the Ipatiev monastery ended in the Ipatiev house. Russians noticed this within months and have not stopped noticing it since, and there is nothing whatever behind it. The two Ipatievs are unrelated, 3 centuries apart, one a saint and one a retired engineer. It is pure accident, but it has the shape of design, and human beings are not built to leave that alone. What happened between those two buildings is the subject of this account. It is on one level the story of the accumulation of the largest personal fortune ever attached to a single European family. Land measured not in acres but in provinces, mines, forests, gold, palaces by the dozen. A treasury in which the property of the state and the property of the household had never been meaningfully separated, and a collection of stones that is still, more than a century later, the most valuable object in any Russian museum. On another level, it is a story about how quickly such a thing can cease to exist, because the striking fact about the Romanov fortune is not its size, it is the speed. In February of 1913, the family celebrated 300 years on the throne, with an expenditure that embarrassed some of its own ministers. 4 years later, there was nothing. No throne, no capital, no access to a single ruble of it, no legal standing in which to claim any part of it, and within another 18 months, no family either. Subscribe for more documentaries on the great dynasties of old money. New episodes every week. This is where such a story usually acquires a moral, and the moral is usually about decadence. That version is available, and it is not quite true. The last emperor of Russia was, by the private standards of his class, an unusually temperate man, faithful to his wife, devoted to his children, physically strong, punctual, orderly, personally frugal, in ways that irritated the court around him. He did not gamble. He did not keep mistresses after his marriage. He kept a diary in which he recorded the weather and the number of birds he had shot, and almost nothing about what he felt. He was also, by nearly universal assessment, the wrong man to be given absolute power over 130 million people at the exact moment when the arrangement holding them together stopped working. That is a different kind of failure than decadence, and in the end it proved more expensive. But we should begin where the family began, with a boy who did not want the throne in a monastery in the snow. The century that produced him had almost finished Russia off. For 700 years, the country had been ruled by descendants of a single line, and in 1598 that line ended. What followed is remembered in Russian by a phrase that translates, with characteristic understatement, as the time of troubles. There was famine that emptied whole districts. There were pretenders, men who appeared claiming to be a dead prince, gathered armies, took Moscow, and were destroyed in their turn. There was invasion from Poland and from Sweden. There was a period in which a foreign garrison sat in the Moscow Kremlin and a foreign prince was seriously proposed for the Russian throne. The Romanovs were not, in this period, a ruling family. They were a boyar clan of the second rank whose principal distinction was a marriage. A Romanov daughter, Anastasia, had been the first and by all accounts the best-loved wife of Ivan IV. That connection made them plausible, and therefore made them dangerous, and under Boris Godunov the family was systematically dismantled. The brothers were exiled to remote places, several of them died in confinement. The eldest, Fyodor Nikitich, was forced to take monastic vows under the name Filaret, which removed him permanently from the succession, and his wife was compelled to do the same. Their small son, Mikhail, was left with his mother in the provinces. By 1612, the foreign garrison had been driven out of Moscow by a militia raised in the provinces, and the men who had done it faced the problem. They had a country and no government and no legitimate claimant to put at the head of it. An assembly of the land was called. It opened in the Kremlin in January of 1613, and it contained not only the great families but townsmen, minor gentry, churchmen, and representatives of the provinces, an unusually broad body by the standards of the age, and one that would not be equaled in Russia again for 300 years. They argued for weeks. Every powerful candidate was unacceptable to somebody, because every powerful candidate had done something during the troubles that somebody else could not forgive. And gradually the assembly converged on a boy of 16 whose chief qualification was that he had done nothing at all, because he had been too young to do anything. A boy with the right blood, no army, no faction, and it was assumed no capacity to resist the men who would govern in his name. In March of 1613, they elected Mikhail Romanov Tsar and sent a delegation to Kostroma to inform him. The scene at the monastery has been painted many times, and the paintings are all sentimental, and the underlying account is probably accurate in its essentials. The boy refused. His mother refused more strenuously. She pointed out to the delegation at length that the previous holders of this office had been murdered, deposed, or driven mad, that the country was destroyed, that the treasury was empty, and that she had already lost most of her family to Russian politics and did not intend to donate the remainder. They argued for hours. In the end, she consented, and the boy consented, and they came down out of Kostroma to Moscow in the spring. He was crowned in July of 1613. He reigned for 32 years, mostly under the direction of others, his mother at first, and then, after 1619, his father, who returned from Polish captivity, was elected patriarch and governed the country in his son's name with an authority nobody troubled to disguise. It was an unpromising beginning, a reluctant child installed by committee in a ruined state, and yet the arrangement held. The country slowly refilled, the borders slowly steadied, and the family that had been reduced to 2 people in a provincial monastery began, with a patience that is genuinely remarkable, to accumulate. What they accumulated needs describing carefully, because the modern way of describing it is misleading. If you search for the wealth of the last emperor of Russia, you will encounter, almost immediately, a figure in the region of $300 billion, and a claim that he was among the richest human beings who ever lived. That figure has been repeated so often that it has acquired the texture of fact. It is an artifact of arithmetic. It is produced by taking the assets of the Russian state, the crown lands, the mineral rights, the treasury, the regalia, treating them as one man's personal property, and converting the total into present-day currency by a method that produces very large numbers and very little meaning. The truth is both smaller and stranger. There were, by the end, essentially 4 fortunes tangled together, and no one at the time was entirely certain where one ended and another began. The first was the appanage estate, the vast complex of lands, forests, mines, and enterprises set aside in the 1790s to support the imperial family as a family, administered by its own department, and producing an income that had to be divided among a great many grand dukes and grand duchesses, each of whom received a defined allowance fixed by law. A grand duke did not have a bank balance. He had an entitlement. The second was the cabinet estate, enormous holdings in Siberia and the Altai, gold, silver, copper, timber, held by the emperor in his capacity as emperor rather than as a private man, and administered by a chancellery that kept accounts and expected them to be respected. The third was the state treasury proper, which was not the emperor's money at all in any modern sense, though the distinction was academic while he held absolute power and became painfully concrete the moment he stopped. And the fourth was the part that people actually mean when they say fortune: the stones, the regalia in the Kremlin, and the Winter Palace, The great crown made for Catherine with its thousands of diamonds and its enormous red spinel, the personal jewels of the empresses accumulated over 2 centuries, and the ornaments and objects commissioned from the court jewelers of St. Petersburg in the last decades before the collapse. Of these, only the fourth was portable, and only the fourth would matter afterwards. The accumulation took roughly 2 centuries, and it was driven by two people in particular. The first was the great-grandson of the boy from Kostroma. He came to the throne as a child, took it properly in his 20s, and spent his life doing something that no ruler of that country had attempted before. He tried to drag it, by force, into the same century as Western Europe. He traveled abroad in disguise and worked in a Dutch shipyard. He came home and made his nobles shave. He built an army and a navy that had not existed, fought a 20-year war with Sweden, and won it, and then did the thing that defines him. He built a city on a marsh. There was no reason for St. Petersburg. The ground was waterlogged, the climate was punishing, the sea froze, and the site was so close to a hostile border that its safety depended entirely on continuing to win. It was built anyway by conscripted labor, at a cost in lives that was not recorded because nobody was counting, and by 1712 it was the capital of the Russian Empire, a European city laid out on European lines facing west. Everything that follows in this story happens in the shadow of that decision. The Romanovs after Peter were a dynasty that governed an overwhelmingly rural, Orthodox Eastern country from a Baroque city built to impress Paris and Vienna. The distance between the palace and the village was not merely social, it was cultural, linguistic. The court spoke French, and in the end, fatal. There is one more thing to say about Peter, because it establishes a pattern that recurs in this family with a regularity that becomes difficult to dismiss. He had a son by his first marriage named Alexei, who grew up while his father was away making war and who turned out to be everything his father despised. Pious, unmilitary, attached to the old Muscovite world that was being dismantled around him, and surrounded by men who were waiting for the emperor to die. In the 17 teens, the relationship broke down completely. The young man fled abroad and took refuge with the Austrians. He was pursued, persuaded to return with assurances that were not honored, tried by a court of his father's own officials, and condemned. He died in the fortress in St. Petersburg a few days later, in circumstances that the government did not explain and that have been argued over ever since. His father outlived him by 7 years and died without naming a successor. What followed was the strangest period in the family's history and the one that is least understood outside Russia. For most of the 18th century, the Russian throne was not inherited. It was taken. Peter's widow, a woman of obscure Baltic origin who had begun life as a servant, was placed on the throne by the Guards regiments. When she died, the crown went to a boy of 12 who was dead within 3 years. Then to a niece who ruled for a decade through a German favorite whom nobody had elected to anything. Then to an infant, a baby of 2 months, proclaimed emperor, and deposed within the year by a nighttime coup, and confined for the rest of a short and entirely obliterated life. Then to Peter's daughter Elizabeth, who arrived at the barracks in person to ask the guards whom they served, and who reigned for 20 years and left the direct male line of the house extinct behind her. The lesson that the 18th century taught the Russian throne was not about legitimacy, it was about the guards. 6 sovereigns in 40 years owed their positions to a few thousand soldiers in the capital, who could be brought out on a winter night by a determined person with a plausible claim, and the family understood this perfectly and organized itself accordingly. Which is why, at the end of that century, one emperor made a change that would matter enormously in 1917. Having watched his own mother take the throne over his father's body, Paul I fixed the succession by law in the male line, strictly by primogeniture, precisely so that no woman would ever again be able to do what she had done. He was himself removed by a conspiracy of officers a few years later, in his own new palace, in circumstances his son never publicly discussed. But the law stood, and a century later it meant that a man with 4 healthy daughters and no son had, in the eyes of his own state, no heir at all. The second great accumulator arrived half a century later and was not a Romanov at all. She was a minor German princess from Stettin. married at 16 to the heir to the Russian throne, a young man whom she disliked and who disliked her. In 1762, her husband became emperor and lasted 6 months. He was removed by a conspiracy of guards officers and died shortly afterwards in circumstances that his own government did not explain and that historians have argued about ever since. His widow was proclaimed empress in his place and reigned for 34 years and is remembered as Catherine the Great. She was, by any measure, the most capable ruler the dynasty produced. She was also, and this is the part relevant to us, the most acquisitive. Under Catherine, the empire absorbed the Crimea and a great part of Poland. Under Catherine, the court became a serious buyer in the European art market, purchasing entire collections wholesale from bankrupt aristocrats and struggling estates, and installing them in a building beside the Winter Palace, which she called her hermitage. A private retreat, she said, seen by herself and the mice. That collection is now one of the 2 or 3 greatest in the world, and it was assembled, essentially, as a state purchasing program conducted by a private woman with unlimited credit. Under Catherine, too, the great crown was worn for the first time. A hemisphere of silver and gold, carrying nearly 5,000 diamonds, in a spinel the size of a small egg, made in a matter of months by a court jeweler who was told the deadline and not consulted about it. And under Catherine, the arrangement that would eventually destroy the family was carried to its logical extreme. The Russian nobility were released from any obligation to serve the state. The peasantry were not released from anything. Serfdom was extended into the newly acquired territories. And by the end of her reign, a substantial part of the population of Europe's largest country was, in law, transferable property. That was the machine. A European court, a Byzantine autocracy, an agrarian economy resting on bonded labor, and a family at the top of it whose income depended on all three. It ran for another century, and it is worth pausing on how that century felt from inside the palace, because the confidence of the last generation is otherwise inexplicable. In 1812, the largest army Europe had ever assembled crossed the Russian frontier and marched on Moscow, and Moscow burned, and the army that had taken it came apart on the road home in the snow. 2 years later, a Romanov emperor rode into Paris at the head of the Allied armies and dictated terms to a continent. For the next 4 decades, Russia was the arbiter of Europe, the power that suppressed revolutions elsewhere, the gendarme of the old order, whose armies were assumed to be inexhaustible. His younger brother Nicholas I inherited the throne in 1825 in the middle of an attempted coup by officers who wanted a constitution, put it down within a day, and spent the following 30 years ensuring that nothing of the kind could happen again. He created the political police that would outlive the dynasty in one form or another. He put the empire in uniform. Literally, officials of every department were given ranks and tunics, and the country was administered as though it were a barracks in which the barracks itself was the point. And the confidence lasted until the 1850s, when the empire went to war in the Crimea against the French and the British, and discovered that an army raised by conscripting serfs and supplied by roads that turned to mud could not defeat industrial powers who arrived by steamship. The war was lost on Russian soil, within Russia's own borders, by a country that had believed itself the strongest in Europe. Nicholas I died in the middle of it, and there were people at the time who said, without evidence, that he had not wanted to survive the news. His son drew the opposite conclusion from his father's, and it is the last genuine hinge in this story. In the 1860s, the great-grandson of Catherine did the bravest and most dangerous thing any Romanov ever did. In 1861, Alexander II abolished serfdom, freeing something in the order of 23 million people, 2 years before the American proclamation that is far better known in the English-speaking world. He reformed the courts. He created elected local assemblies. He relaxed the censorship, reorganized the army, and permitted the beginnings of a public life. And the lesson that his family took from what happened to him afterwards is the reason the dynasty ended. Because the reforms did not produce gratitude. They produced appetite. The peasants who had been freed were freed without adequate land and with redemption payments that took generations to discharge. The educated young who had been permitted to think began to think about the autocracy itself. Revolutionary circles formed and were crushed and reformed. And over the course of the 1870s, a small number of them concluded that the emperor personally was the obstacle and set about removing him. They failed repeatedly. They tried in the street, on a train, and inside the Winter Palace itself, where an explosion in 1880 killed members of the guard and did not touch the family. On the 13th of March, 1881, they succeeded. Alexander II was assassinated in a St. Petersburg street while returning to the palace. He was, that same afternoon, reported to have been carrying in his study the draft of a document extending representative institutions in Russia. It was never issued. His son was 36 years old and had watched his father die. Alexander III was an enormous man, physically the strongest of the dynasty, famously able to bend a poker with his hands, and famously uninterested in the refinements his ancestors had imported. He wore Russian dress. He preferred the Danish wife he had inherited from a dead brother, Princess Dagmar of Denmark, who took the name Maria Fyodorovna and became, over the following decades, the most popular member of the imperial family. He disliked St. Petersburg and lived, when he could, in a fortified palace at Gatchina outside it, where the family occupied a set of low-ceilinged rooms on an upper floor rather than the state apartments below. And he drew from his father's death the only conclusion he thought was available. Reform had killed the reformer. Therefore, there would be no more reform. For 13 years, he governed accordingly. The elected assemblies were curtailed, the universities disciplined, the press supervised, the borderlands pressed toward the Russian language in the Orthodox Church. He fought no wars, which earned him the title of peacemaker, and he presided over the beginning of the great industrial expansion that would give Russia, within a generation, some of the largest factories in Europe and a working class concentrated in a handful of cities, a development whose implications he did not live to see. He also, and this matters enormously, treated his heir as a boy. The eldest son, Nicholas, was born in May of 1868 and was by all accounts a pleasant, modest, and unassertive young man, fluent in several languages, well-mannered, fond of exercise, and of his family, entirely without the physical presence or the appetite for command that his father possessed in surplus. He was given a superb education in everything except the thing he would actually have to do. He was not admitted to the Council of Ministers in any meaningful way. When it was suggested that he should be given some genuine administrative responsibility, his father is said to have asked what the hurry was. There was a great deal of hurry. Alexander III was 49 years old and his kidneys were failing. In the autumn of 1894, the emperor went south to the Crimea, to the small palace at Livadia above the Black Sea, in the hope that the climate would do what the doctors could not. It did not. And in those weeks, two things happened at once that would set the shape of everything afterwards. The first was that the heir sent for the woman he intended to marry. Her name was Alex, and she was a princess of Hesse and by Rhine, the granddaughter of Queen Victoria of Great Britain, whose court she had partly grown up in after her own mother died when she was 6. She was tall, extremely beautiful, painfully shy in company, and religiously serious in a way that people who met her found either admirable or alarming. She had refused Nicholas more than once on the grounds that she could not change her faith, and had at last been persuaded in the spring of 1894. She arrived at Livadia in October, traveling on an ordinary passenger train because there had been no time to arrange anything else. The dying emperor insisted on receiving her in full uniform and gave her his blessing. On the 1st of November, he died, and the second thing happened. A young man of 26 who had never been permitted to make a serious decision became the autocrat of all the Russias. He is reported to have said that evening to a cousin that he did not know what would become of him, that he was not prepared to be a czar, that he had never wanted to be one and understood nothing of governing. The remark is quoted in almost every account of his reign, and it is not clear that it is verbatim. What is clear is that everyone present agreed about the substance. The next day, Alex was received into the Orthodox Church and took the name Alexandra Fyodorovna. 17 days later, the old emperor was buried in the fortress cathedral in St. Petersburg after nearly 2 weeks of liturgies in a slow procession the length of the country. And 8 days after the funeral, on the 26th of November, chosen because the Dowager Empress's birthday permitted a brief relaxation of court mourning, the new emperor married in the chapel of the Winter Palace. The bride wore silver, the guests wore black. There was no honeymoon and no public celebration, and the newly married couple went to live not in a palace of their own, but in a set of rooms in the residence of the emperor's mother, which is precisely as awkward as it sounds. A phrase went round St. Petersburg in the following weeks, attributed to nobody in particular and repeated by everybody. She comes to us behind a coffin. The marriage itself was one of the happiest in the history of European royalty and one of the most disastrous. Both things are true, and they are the same fact. The letters between them, which survive in enormous quantity, are the letters of two people who remained, after 23 years, in love in a manner that their contemporaries found faintly embarrassing. They also show a man who consistently deferred to the political judgment of the one person in Russia with less political judgment than himself. She was not equipped for the position. Her German upbringing and English adolescence gave her no instinct for the elaborate, exhausting, deeply performative social machinery of the Russian court, and her shyness read as coldness, and her coldness was resented, and the resentment made her withdraw further, which produced more resentment. Within a few years, she had effectively stopped appearing in society. The aristocracy of St. Petersburg, which had adored her mother-in-law, concluded that the new empress despised them and never revised the verdict. And then, in May of 1896, came the coronation, and the first of the omens that people would later assemble into a pattern. The ceremonies in Moscow were among the most elaborate ever staged in Europe. Weeks of processions, illuminations, receptions, and services of extraordinary length in the Kremlin cathedrals. On the fourth day, a popular festival was held on a field outside the city called Kodinka, where the new emperor's health would be drunk and where, by tradition, gifts would be distributed. Enameled cups, gingerbread, sausage, beer. 500,000 people came. The field had been used as a military training ground and was crossed with ditches and trenches that had not been filled in. A rumor ran through the crowd before dawn that there would not be enough for everybody. The crowd surged toward the booths. A great many people died in the crush. The precise figure was disputed at the time and remains uncertain. What is not in dispute is that the disaster was entirely preventable, and that responsibility for it was never properly assigned. That evening, a ball was to be held at the French embassy. The emperor's instinct, in the empresses, was to cancel it. His uncles argued that to stay away would insult France, Russia's new and expensive ally, at a delicate moment. He went. The image of a young sovereign dancing while the carts were still removing the dead from Kodinka field entered Russian political consciousness and never left it. It was unfair in the sense that he had spent that day visiting hospitals and would personally pay pensions to the families. It was accurate in the sense that it captured precisely the defining failure of his reign, an inability to see how things would look, and an inability to say no to the men around him until it was too late for the answer to matter. The children came quickly, and each of them was a disappointment to somebody. Olga was born in November of 1895, less than a year after the wedding. Tatiana followed in the summer of 1897, Maria in the summer of 1899, Anastasia in the summer of 1901. 4 daughters in 6 years, healthy, intelligent, by every surviving account close to one another, and unusually unspoilt, educated at home, dressed alike, and known within the family by an acronym formed from their initials, as though they were a single organism rather than 4 girls. And 4 daughters was, under Russian law, a catastrophe. The succession had been fixed at the end of the 18th century in the male line by a Romanov emperor who wished to ensure that no woman would ever again do to him what had been done to his father. A daughter could not inherit. If the emperor died without a son, the crown would pass to his brother, and the empress would find herself the widow of one reign and the mother of nothing in the next. By the summer of 1901, after the 4th girl, the pressure on Alexandra had passed from social to almost unbearable. She was 30. She was already unpopular. She was already devout to a degree that struck the court as excessive. And she began, in this period, to seek help outside the ordinary channels. From healers, from mystics, from a French spiritualist who was investigated by the police and asked to leave. On the 12th of August, 1904, in the middle of a war that was going badly, she gave birth to a son. He was named Alexei. The guns of the fortress fired 300 rounds. The country was told. And within 6 weeks, his parents knew what almost nobody else in Russia would be permitted to know for the next 13 years. The child was a hemophiliac. The condition ran in the descendants of Queen Victoria and had already appeared among Alexandra's own relatives. She had seen it in her family, and she understood immediately and completely both what it meant and where it had come from. A bruise could become an internal hemorrhage. A minor knock could put him in bed for weeks in serious pain. There was, in 1904, no treatment of any kind. The medical prognosis for a hemophiliac boy in that era was measured in years, not decades. The decision was made to conceal it absolutely. The heir to the Russian throne was photographed constantly and described in the press as a robust child. And when he could not walk, he was carried by a sailor of the Imperial Guard who was assigned to him permanently and whose real function was understood by perhaps 24 people in the empire. Everything that people find inexplicable about the last years of the dynasty follows from that decision. The withdrawal of the empress from public life. Her increasing reliance on anyone who offered hope. The family's retreat into the smaller palace at Tsarskoye Selo, out of sight. And above all, her attachment to a Siberian peasant with an extraordinary presence who arrived at court a few years later and who appeared, repeatedly, and in front of witnesses, and in ways that have never been satisfactorily explained, to be able to stop the boy's bleeding. Grigory Rasputin was not a monk and held no religious office. He was a wanderer of the type Russian Orthodoxy has always produced and never quite known what to do with. A man of peasant background, largely uneducated, with a gift for speech and an unnerving directness that impressed a great many educated people who expected to be unimpressed. He drank. He was, on the evidence, promiscuous in ways that scandalized even a tolerant city. The police kept a file on him for years. He was also the only person on earth whom the empress believed could keep her son alive. And after an episode in 1912, when the boy suffered an injury that put him in agony for days and brought him close to death, and after which he recovered following a telegram from Rasputin, that belief became unshakable. It is important to be careful here because this is the point at which every account of the Romanovs starts to lose its footing. Rasputin did not govern Russia. He held no office and could not issue an order. What he possessed was access, and in an autocracy where every appointment ultimately depended on the will of one man, who in turn deferred to his wife, who in turn deferred to Rasputin's opinion of a candidate's soul, access was enough to be catastrophic. By 1915 and 1916, with the emperor away at military headquarters and the empress managing the government by correspondence, ministers were being appointed and dismissed at a pace that made coherent administration impossible, and the country believed, rightly in outline, wildly wrongly in detail, that the empire was being run by a drunken peasant and a German-born empress. The rumors that circulated about the two of them were filthy, ubiquitous, printed abroad, whispered in the Duma, and repeated by members of the imperial family itself. Rasputin was murdered by a group of noblemen in December of 1916. The killing solved nothing whatever. It removed a symptom, made the empress more isolated and more certain that she was surrounded by enemies, and demonstrated to the country that even the aristocracy had lost confidence in the throne. 10 weeks later, the throne was gone. But we have run ahead, and there is a decade in between that has to be accounted for, because the collapse of 1917 was not the first collapse, it was the second. For any of that, in the February of 1903, there was a ball. It was held in the Winter Palace over 2 evenings, and it was given to mark 290 years of the dynasty, and it remains the most photographed private event in the history of Imperial Russia. 390 guests were invited. On the second evening, every one of them arrived dressed in the style of the 1600s, not in fancy dress in the ordinary sense, but in costumes designed by serious artists with the assistance of historians, made by the best workshops in St. Petersburg, and in several dozen cases incorporating genuine objects brought up from the Kremlin armory in Moscow for the occasion. The emperor came as Alexei, the second czar of his house, the son of the boy from Kostroma. The empress came as Alexei's first wife. The ladies wore the old Russian sarafan and the Kokoshin headdress. The officers appointed to dance came as 17th century archers and falconers. There was a concert in the Hermitage Theater with the greatest bass and the greatest ballerina of the age. There was dinner in the rooms hung with Spanish and Flemish pictures. And afterwards, a photographer set up a painted backdrop imitating the chambers of the old Moscow palace. And the guests were taken one by one, and the results were bound into an album that has been reproduced continuously ever since. And that is, in a plain sense, the single most beautiful surviving document of the Russian court. On the staircase of the theater, the whole imperial family was photographed together. It was the last time they ever were. What makes the ball worth pausing on is not the expense, though the expense was extraordinary. It is what the costumes meant. The court of St. Petersburg, a European capital, built to face west, in which the aristocracy conversed in French, had spent an evening dressing as the Muscovy that Peter had destroyed in order to build it. It was intended as a statement that the true Russia was the old Russia, that the bond between Tsar and people ran through the 17th century and not through the 19th, and that the reforms of the intervening 200 years had been a detour. 2 years later, the statement was tested, and the answer came back from the streets of the city in which the ball had been held. The war with Japan that began in 1904 was entered into carelessly in the expectation of a short victorious campaign and was lost comprehensively. A fleet was sent halfway around the world and destroyed. A fortress was surrendered. And a country that had been told it was invincible discovered, in the newspapers, that it was not. On a Sunday in January of 1905, a large procession of workers and their families walked toward the Winter Palace to present a petition. They carried icons and portraits of the emperor. They were not revolutionaries. The petition addressed him as a father. Troops opened fire on them at several points in the city. The number of dead was disputed then and is disputed now. The emperor was not in the palace and had not given the order. It made no difference at all. The word that attached itself to that day attached itself permanently, and the mystical bond between the Tsar and the ordinary Russian, which had been the actual foundation of the whole arrangement, more than any law or any army, was broken in a single morning and never repaired. The rest of that year was strikes, mutinies, peasant risings, and the paralysis of the railways. In October, the emperor was presented by his ministers with two options: military dictatorship or concession. He signed a manifesto granting civil liberties and an elected legislature. He regretted it immediately and spent the following 12 years attempting to reduce what he had granted. The assembly was dissolved twice in quick succession when it proved uncooperative. The franchise was rewritten to produce a more agreeable chamber. The most capable minister of the reign, Pyotr Stolypin, pushed through a land reform of real ambition and was assassinated in a Kiev theater in 1911 in the emperor's presence. And through all of it, the surface of the thing remained magnificent. That is the part that survives in photographs, and it is the reason this family occupies the place it does in the imagination. Because while the machinery underneath was failing, the court of St. Petersburg was producing objects of a refinement that has never been surpassed. Every Easter, beginning in the 1880s, the emperor commissioned from the court jeweler an ornamental egg, a single object, unique each year, taking most of a year to make, containing a concealed surprise, and given to the empress. After 1894, there were two each year, one for the wife, one for the mother. 50 of them were delivered before the end. They were made of rock crystal in enamel and gold, set with thousands of stones so small that their individual value was negligible and their collective effect was frost, or water, or lace. The firm that made them deserves a paragraph of its own, because it was not a jeweler in the ordinary sense. The house of Fabergé at its height employed several hundred people in St. Petersburg and Moscow, organized into workshops each run by a master craftsman who signed his own work. Goldsmiths, enamelers, stonecutters, miniature painters, and its distinguishing conviction was that the value of an object should have almost nothing to do with the cost of the materials in it. The firm made cigarette cases of gunmetal. It made flowers in a glass of water, where the water was a cylinder of solid rock crystal, cut so precisely that the illusion is uncomfortable to look at. It made small animals out of agate and jasper for people who wanted small animals. Its clients were the court, the great families, and eventually every royal house in Europe. And its reputation rested on the idea that Russia, which imported its architecture, its furniture, its manners, and its language of polite conversation, could produce something that nobody else could. 69 of the great eggs were made in all, of which 50 were delivered to the imperial family. 2 were finished in 1917 and never handed over, because by Easter of that year, there was no one left to give them to. The firm was nationalized. Its workshops were emptied. The man whose name was on the door left Russia and died a few years later in Switzerland, and his sons reestablished something under the family name in Paris in the 1920s, refurbishing and reproducing for a clientele of exiles who wanted to be reminded. They cost, individually, more than a factory worker in St. Petersburg would earn in a lifetime. That was not concealed. It was the point. The whole apparatus of the late imperial court, the jewels, the palaces, the household of thousands, the fleet of imperial trains and yachts, existed to say something to a population that had almost no other contact with its rulers. It is worth stopping here to describe what that court actually cost, because the figures are difficult to hold in the mind, and they explain a great deal about what happened afterwards. The imperial household was an institution with its own ministry, its own budget, its own police, its own doctors, its own singers, and something on the order of 15,000 people on its payroll, a bureaucracy the size of a small government, whose entire function was the maintenance of one family's daily life. That family had, in round terms, more than a dozen palaces available to it at any moment. The Winter Palace in the capital, which was used for ceremony and almost never lived in by the last emperor. The Alexander Palace at Tsarskoye Selo, 15 miles out, which is where they actually lived, in a small suite of rooms furnished in the comfortable English style the empress had grown up with. Peterhof on the Gulf, Gachina, Levadia in the Crimea, rebuilt in white stone, a hunting estate in Poland. Others in Moscow, in Finland, and elsewhere, kept staffed and heated whether or not anyone came. There were 2 imperial yachts, one of them among the largest private vessels afloat, and a set of imperial trains, an entire railway household of blue carriages containing a study, a dining room, a chapel, and accommodation for a court in miniature, which is where the emperor was living when the monarchy ended. And there was the jewelry, which is the part that has to be understood correctly. The great pieces were not, in any ordinary sense, owned by the people who wore them. The coronation regalia and the principal historic stones belonged to the crown, were catalogued, and could not be given away or sold. An empress had the use of them and no more. What was personal was the rest, the tiaras and the parures and the gifts of 30 years. And it was substantial, and it was the only part of the whole apparatus that could be picked up and carried out of a burning building. That is why the sewing in Tobolsk matters. A family that had been, on paper, the richest in Europe spent the winter of 1917 quietly stitching the last liquid fraction of its wealth into the seams of its own clothing, because it had correctly concluded that this was the only form in which money would still exist for them. And here it is necessary to say something about the 4 young women doing the sewing, because in almost every account of this family, they are treated as a chorus. They were not identical, and they were not interchangeable. Olga, the eldest, was the most bookish and the most obviously her father's daughter, quick, moody, given to reading and to sudden strong opinions. Tatiana was the organizer, tall, composed, the one the others deferred to in practice, the one who ran things. Maria was the warm one, physically the strongest, famously good with people, and troubled all her adolescence by the conviction that she was the least remarkable of the 4. Anastasia, the youngest, was the family's comedian, small, unmanageable, an accomplished mimic, and the least interested in behaving. They were brought up in conditions that their contemporaries in other courts found eccentric to the point of comedy. They slept on camp beds. They took cold baths in the morning. Their clothes were passed down from sister to sister, and their allowances were small. They had almost no acquaintance with anyone outside the household, and the family's isolation, which had begun as a response to a sick child and hardened into a habit, meant that they grew into adulthood knowing sailors, officers, and servants far better than they knew the aristocracy of their own capital. When the war came, the Empress did the one thing in her life that ought to have made her popular. She trained as a nurse, a real qualification, not an honorary one, and took her two eldest daughters through the same course, and they worked in the hospital at Tsarskoye Selo through the war years, dressing wounds, assisting at operations, sitting with the dying. The photographs exist and are extraordinary. Two young women who would in any other generation have been marrying foreign princes are shown in plain gray with white headscarves, in a ward doing work that most women of their class would not have gone within a mile of. It changed nothing. By 1916, the country believed the Empress was a traitor, and her daughters were pitied at best. The nursing was reported and was assumed to be a pose. That is perhaps the cruelest small fact in the whole story, that the one authentically admirable thing the last Empress of Russia did in public was disbelieved because of what people had already decided about her. In February of 1913, the family said it as loudly as it has ever been said. The tercentenary of the House of Romanov was celebrated across the empire for most of a year, and it was designed deliberately and explicitly as an argument. The argument ran like this. The dynasty had been called to the throne in 1613 not by a party or a faction or a constitution, but by the whole Russian land, assembled in one place and speaking with one voice. Therefore, the bond between the emperor and the people was direct, personal, and sacred. And everything that had come between them since, the ministers, the bureaucracy, the newspapers, and above all the elected assembly sitting in the Tauride Palace, was an intrusion. The celebrations were staged to make that visible. In February in St. Petersburg, there was a salute from the fortress guns in a procession from the Winter Palace to the cathedral on the Nevsky Prospect, with tens of thousands lining the road. The seating at the service was arranged so that the elected deputies were placed well back, and the president of the assembly, arriving to find his own seat occupied by Rasputin, had to have the matter resolved by argument in the aisle of a cathedral. Then, in May, the family went on pilgrimage. They traveled the route of the first Romanov, down the Volga by steamer, through the old towns of Muscovy, receiving bread and salt from village delegations, moving between the ancient churches of a Russia that had been receding for 200 years. Peasants knelt in the roads, choirs sang on the riverbanks. The prime minister, watching from a discreet distance, noted in his memoirs that the crowds in many places were thin and the enthusiasm was polite rather than fervent, and that the local authorities had gone to some trouble to ensure that the wrong sort of person did not appear at all. And on the 19th of May, 1913, the imperial family arrived at Kostroma and walked in procession into the Ipatiev monastery, into the very courtyard where a boy of 16 had refused the crown 3 centuries earlier. The heir could not walk the last part of it. He was carried by a Cossack of the Guard, as he was carried in Moscow a week later, in front of the crowds on Red Square, to what one witness described as sounds of grief from the people watching. That is the photograph of the dynasty at its last moment of confidence. A boy who cannot walk in the arms of a soldier in the courtyard of the monastery where it all began. It is worth saying, before the war comes, that the years between 1907 and 1914 were not a slow slide toward an inevitable end. They were, by most measures, the most successful period in the economic history of the empire. Industrial output grew at rates comparable with any country in the world. Railways were built at speed. The land reform pushed through by Stolypin was dismantling the old village commune and creating, deliberately, a class of independent peasant proprietors with something to lose, which was precisely the point, and which its author said would require 20 years of peace to complete. Foreign capital came in. Literacy rose. A press existed, quarrelsome and censored, but real. An elected assembly sat, was ignored on the questions that mattered, and nonetheless accumulated the habits of parliamentary life. Russia in 1913 was not a country waiting to collapse. It was a country in the middle of a transformation that had a plausible chance of succeeding, governed by a man who did not believe in the transformation and was attempting to slow it down. What it did not have was the 20 years. In the summer of 1914, a chain of alliances and mobilization timetables that nobody fully controlled brought the empire into a European war against the industrial power on its western border. The emperor signed the order for general mobilization, canceled it, and signed it again, and then wrote in his diary that he had gone for a walk. What that war did to the Russian Empire has been described at length elsewhere and does not need to be described in detail here. This is an account of a family, and the relevant facts are simple and terrible. The army fought better than its reputation suggests and was destroyed anyway, because it could not be supplied. The railways, which had been inadequate in peace, collapsed under military traffic. Food stopped reaching the cities while grain rotted in the provinces. Prices went up and wages did not. And the men in the trenches were replaced and replaced again out of the villages. In the late summer of 1915, against the advice of nearly every minister, the emperor took personal command of the army and left the capital for headquarters at Mogilev. It was, in his own terms, an honorable decision. The country was in danger, and he would not sit in a palace while it was decided. In every practical sense, it was the single worst decision of his reign. It attached his name personally to every defeat. It removed him from the government at the exact moment when the government was disintegrating. And it left the administration of the empire by correspondence in the hands of the least popular woman in Russia at the exact moment when the country had begun to believe that she was working for the enemy. She was not. The accusation was false, and she was, if anything, more fiercely committed to Russian victory than her husband, having transferred to her adopted country the whole intensity of a convert. It made no difference. She was German by birth, and the country was losing, and the country needed a reason. By the beginning of 1917, the reason had been settled on, and the end was very close. It began in March with bread queues in the capital. There had been bread queues before. What was different this time was that when the crowds refused to disperse and the garrison was ordered to clear the streets, the garrison, made up of reservists and recruits who did not want to be sent to the front, refused and then joined them. The emperor was at headquarters 500 miles away and did what he had done in every previous crisis. He ordered firmness and then set off for home. His train was stopped short of the capital, at Pskov, by railwaymen who no longer took his orders. There, in a railway carriage, on the 15th of March, 1917, he was informed by his own generals, the commanders of every front, unanimously, that he no longer had the confidence of the army and should go. He signed the abdication that afternoon, first in favor of his son. Then, having asked the doctors a question he had never asked in public before, whether the boy could be expected to live, and whether he could be kept in Russia if his parents were sent away, he changed the document and abdicated for his son as well, in favor of his brother. His brother declined the throne the following day, pending a constituent assembly that never convened. 304 years after the assembly of the land had elected a boy in a monastery, the thing simply stopped. There was no battle for it. Nobody defended it. Within a week, the imperial arms were being prized off buildings all over Russia, and the officers of an army that had sworn to the emperor personally were swearing to a provisional government instead, and almost nobody in the country appears to have minded. He wrote in his diary that evening that all around him was treason and cowardice and deceit. He then recorded the time of his departure and the weather. The family was reunited at the Alexander Palace at Tsarskoye Selo under house arrest. The conditions at first were mild. The household staff who wished to stay were permitted to stay. The kitchens continued to function. The children, most of them recovering from measles, convalesced. And the former emperor spent his days sawing wood in the park and reading aloud to his family in the evenings. He seems, by every account, including his own, to have been happier in those months than at any time in 23 years. The relief of no longer being responsible was visible to everyone who saw him. There is a set of photographs from that spring, taken by the family themselves, and they are among the strangest images of the century. A middle-aged man in a peasant shirt digging a vegetable bed in the park of a palace he no longer owns, watched by a soldier with a rifle. 4 young women in headscarves, shaven-headed because the measles and its fever had cost them their hair, sitting on a felled tree in the sun and laughing at something outside the frame. A boy in a sailor suit playing with a dog. They planted a kitchen garden that spring, the whole family and most of the household together, several hundred square yards of it, and they harvested it in the summer. The guards helped. Some of the guards, it should be said, were perfectly decent to them, and some were not, and the proportions shifted month by month with the news from the capital. The daughters wrote letters, the empress read theology. The former emperor, who had commanded the largest army in the world 8 weeks earlier, asked for permission to move to the Crimea, and was refused, and asked instead whether the family might be allowed to live somewhere in Russia as private people, and was told that the question was under consideration. There was one obvious solution, and it very nearly happened. The British government, approached in March, reluctantly offered asylum. The family were close relations. The King of England and the former emperor were first cousins through their mothers, who were Danish sisters, and the 2 men looked so alike that guests at family weddings had genuinely confused them. Ships could be sent. The Royal Navy had ships in the Baltic. The offer was made within days of the abdication. It was then withdrawn. The withdrawal was communicated as a change of view about the wisdom of the plan given conditions in Russia. The substantial reason established by historians working in the Royal Archives decades later was pressure from the king himself, who had been advised and had come to believe that receiving an autocrat and his German-born wife in wartime Britain would be extremely unpopular with British workers, that the newspapers would be hostile, and that his own position might be damaged by it. His private secretary put the argument to the government repeatedly and in writing until the government gave way. It is one of the quietest and most consequential decisions of the 20th century, and it was not made by a revolutionary. It was made by a cousin. Had those ships sailed, the family would have lived out their lives in some drafty English or Danish house on a diminishing allowance. And Alexei would probably have died in his teens of an illness nobody could treat. And the daughters would have married minor European nobility, or not married at all, and none of us would know their names. The ships did not sail. In August of 1917, with the political situation in the capital deteriorating, the provisional government moved the family east for their own safety to the governor's house in the Siberian town of Tobolsk. They traveled under a false flag on the train as a Japanese Red Cross mission. Tobolsk was cold, dull, provincial, and comparatively safe. They were there for 8 months. The governor's house was large enough. The family had their own rooms and their own furniture brought from Tsarskoye Selo. A number of the household had come with them: tutors, a doctor, ladies-in-waiting, servants. And the town, which had no strong opinions about any of it, sold them food and occasionally left gifts at the gate. The daughters gave concerts and put on plays in French and English for an audience of their parents in the household. The former emperor cleared snow, sawed firewood with his son when the boy was well enough, and complained in his diary about the lack of exercise once the authorities forbade them the street. The empress, whose sciatica made the stairs difficult, sat and embroidered and wrote letters to friends in which she said repeatedly that she was at peace and that what was happening was God's will and that Russia would recover. She also, that winter, did the arithmetic. She and her daughters spent weeks quietly sewing the jewelry they had been permitted to keep into the linings of their clothes, into belts, into the padding of hats and buttons. It was done in the evenings, in a room with a guard on the landing, and it was not romantic. It was a woman who had been the richest consort in Europe, calculating correctly that within a year the only wealth that would still be theirs was the wealth that could be worn without being seen. In the autumn, the government in the capital changed hands again, and the terms of the family's confinement changed with it. The allowances were cut, and the household was reduced accordingly, and butter and coffee came off the table. The guards were replaced with harder men from the industrial towns of the Urals, who removed the epaulets from the former emperor's tunic and addressed him by his surname, and who dismantled the wooden snowslide the family had built in the yard because the daughters had been seen standing on top of it where they could look over the fence and be looked at. In April of 1918, they were moved again, westward this time, back over the Urals, to the industrial city of Ekaterinburg, and into a merchant's house that had been requisitioned from its owner a few days before, its windows painted over and a high double fence built around it. The local authorities called it the House of Special Purpose. They were there for 78 days. Of those days, there is a surprising amount of record, because several of the people inside kept diaries, and because the guards, some of whom were later interviewed, remembered a great deal. The house had belonged to a prosperous engineer and had been comfortable. It was no longer. The windows of the upper floor where the family lived had been painted over with whitewash so that nothing could be seen out of them. One of them was later opened a few inches after repeated requests and closed again after somebody leaned out. A double fence of tall boards was built around the building, high enough to hide the ground floor from the street. Sentries were posted at the gate and on the landings. The routine was fixed and small. They rose late because there was nothing to rise for. There were prayers. There was a period in the garden in the afternoon, half an hour at first, and then less. The former emperor read aloud in the evenings, working through the Russian classics with the patience of a man who had realized he had time. The daughters sewed and played cards and washed handkerchiefs. The boy, who had been injured before the move and could not walk properly, was carried and spent his days in a bed or a chair. The household had been reduced to 4. There had been more, and most had been sent away, and 4 had refused to go. The family doctor, who had a wife and children of his own outside and could have left at any point and did not. The valet, the cook, and the maid. Nothing in their circumstances required this of them. They were not aristocrats and had no stake in a monarchy. They stayed because they had spent years with these people and did not wish to leave them. And they died with them, and their names are on the same wall. There were rumors all that summer of rescue. Letters were smuggled in, some of them, it later emerged, written by the guards themselves as a test, proposing escapes that could not have worked. The family answered one of them. That answer, more than anything else, appears to have shortened the time available to them, because an opposing army was moving toward the city from the east, and the local authorities had concluded that a rescued emperor was more dangerous than a dead one. The last entry in the former empress's diary records the weather, the state of her son's health, and a card game. On the night of the 16th of July, 1918, with an opposing army approaching the city, the family died in circumstances that were concealed for decades. They were killed together with the 4 members of their household who had chosen to remain with them: a doctor, a valet, a cook, and a maid. The following morning, the local authorities announced the death of the former emperor and stated that his wife and children had been moved to a place of safety. That sentence, issued to buy time, is the origin of everything that followed. Every claimant, every rumor, every film, and a century of people who wanted very much to believe that one of them got out. The family in the Ipatiev house were not the only Romanovs, and this is the part of the story that is almost always left out. There were, in 1917, something like 65 members of the imperial house alive: Grand Dukes and Grand Duchesses, princes of the imperial blood, the emperor's brother, his 2 sisters, his mother, and a wide penumbra of cousins who had spent their lives commanding regiments, inspecting artillery, running charities, and quarreling with one another over precedence. Roughly half of them did not survive the following 2 years. The emperor's younger brother, the man in whose favor he had abdicated and who had held the Russian throne for a single day before declining it, was taken from a hotel in Perm in the summer of 1918 and disappeared. His body has never been found. The Empress's elder sister, Elizabeth, had been, in her youth, one of the great beauties of Europe. She had married the emperor's uncle, who was assassinated in Moscow in 1905. She had gone to the prison to see the man responsible, and afterwards she sold everything she owned, including her wedding ring, and founded a convent in Moscow with a hospital, a pharmacy, and an orphanage attached, and spent the rest of her life running it. She was arrested in 1918, taken east, and died the day after her sister in a small town in the Urals, in circumstances that were also concealed. A sister from her convent, who had been offered her freedom, refused it and stayed with her. Elizabeth's remains were eventually carried out of Russia by way of Siberia and China, and buried after several years in the Church of Mary Magdalene in Jerusalem, in a building put up by her father-in-law on the Mount of Olives, which she had visited once as a young woman and had said, apparently in passing, that she would be glad to lie in. Those who got out went mostly through the Crimea in the spring of 1919 on the ship sent for the Dowager Empress, and after that they were émigrés, which is a polite word for people with famous names and no money. The story of the Russian emigration of the 1920s is its own subject and has been told mostly as comedy. Grand dukes driving taxis in Paris, colonels waiting tables, princesses working in couture houses, a whole displaced aristocracy pawning what it had carried out and aligning. Most of it is true. What it obscures is the arithmetic. The jewels that had been sewn into hems in Tobolsk and Kiev and Yalta were sold in Paris and London through the 1920s into a market that was, at exactly that moment, being flooded from Moscow with far better material at far lower prices. The Romanovs who escaped were competing as sellers against the state that had taken everything from them, and losing. Which brings us to the question the whole century has been asking. So where did it go? This is the question that has kept the Romanovs commercially alive for 100 years, and it deserves a careful answer because the popular answer is wrong in an interesting way. Begin with what was seized. When the monarchy fell in March of 1917, the provisional government took control of the appanage department in the cabinet lands almost immediately. The palaces, the Siberian mines, the forests, the stud farms, the porcelain works, the entire industrial and agricultural apparatus that had supported the imperial family as an institution, all of it passed to the state within weeks, and none of it was ever coming back. The family were permitted to keep personal effects and personal jewelry. That was the whole of the estate by the summer of 1917. What would fit in trunks? Then, after the second change of government that autumn, came the rest. The great regalia, the crown of Catherine, the orb, the scepter with its famous diamond, the coronation jewels of a dozen empresses, had been evacuated from St. Petersburg to Moscow in 1914 when the front came uncomfortably close and were sitting in crates in the Kremlin armory. In 1922, a state repository was created to hold them, and the contents were examined by commissions of gemologists who worked in several documented cases without proper inventories. And then the new state, which was bankrupt, at war with itself, and facing famine, did the obvious thing. It sold them. Between the early 1920s and the middle of the 1930s, the treasures of the Russian imperial court entered the international market on a scale that had no precedent and has had no successor. Of the several hundred items cataloged in the Diamond Fund, a substantial majority were disposed of. Jewelry was broken up so that the stones could be sold separately and the settings melted. Paintings went out of the Hermitage, works bought by Catherine herself 2 centuries earlier, and into the hands of a small number of very rich Western buyers who understood exactly what they were being offered and why. Some of the most famous pictures in the National Gallery in Washington were acquired in this way. A Raphael that had hung in the Hermitage went to Andrew Mellon in 1931 for a sum that set a record. A Rubens went to Calouste Gulbenkian and is in Lisbon. The jeweled Easter eggs went too, sold to a London dealer, to an American businessman who had cultivated the new government carefully and who, by the early 1930s, was selling imperial objects in American department stores. 2 of them ended up with the British royal family. Several passed through the collection of an American publisher. Of the 50 imperial eggs delivered before the end, a number have never been traced at all. There were people who fought this. The director of the Kremlin armory spent years securing permission to review what the repository held and to argue object by object that certain things were of national importance and should not leave. He saved a great deal. What he saved is the core of the collection in Moscow that visitors queue for today. But the essential point stands, and it is worth stating plainly because it inverts the usual story. The Romanov fortune was not stolen by the Romanovs and spirited abroad. It was seized, catalogued, and then sold abroad at a discount by the state that had seized it, to buyers in London, Paris, and New York, some of whom are now regarded as great philanthropists on the strength of the museums they left behind. Which brings us to the legend. The story, repeated in countless retellings across the 20th century, holds that the last emperor of Russia deposited enormous sums in foreign banks before the collapse, in London, in Berlin, in New York, and that those deposits, compounding quietly for a century, would now be worth an astronomical figure, and that they are the property of whichever claimant can establish descent. Whether it happened this way, no document confirms. What can be said is this: the deposits that have actually been traced were modest by the standards of the myth. A substantial sum held abroad for the daughters was, on the evidence, repatriated to help fund Russian hospitals during the war. And every serious attempt to locate a great hidden imperial treasury in a Western bank, and there have been many attempts, some of them well-funded, has come back with very little. The legend endures because it is useful. It has funded lawyers, sustained claimants, and sold a great many books. The most persistent form the legend took was human. In the winter of 1920, a young woman was admitted to a Berlin hospital. She would not give her name and was recorded as unknown. Over the following 2 years, she came to say, and then to insist, that she was the youngest daughter of the emperor, that she had survived, and that she had been brought out of Russia. She was, by the eventual verdict of nearly all the surviving Romanov relatives, an imposter. She was, by the verdict of a private investigation funded in 1927 by the Empress's own brother, a Polish factory worker named Franziska Szankowska, who had disappeared from Berlin days before the unknown woman appeared. But she was also intelligent, physically plausible, in possession of an unnerving amount of detail about the interior life of a court she should have known nothing about, and utterly, permanently unshakable. Several people who had known the real Grand Duchess believed her. A German court case ran for decades and ended without resolving anything. She became Anna Anderson. She was the subject of a play, and then of a film for which an actress won an Academy Award, and then of a great many books. She married an American history professor and lived out her last years in Virginia and died in 1984, and her death certificate names the Emperor of Russia as her father. 10 years later, a laboratory settled it. A sample of her tissue, preserved from a hospital operation in the 1970s, was tested against the mitochondrial DNA of the maternal line, a line that runs, conveniently, through Queen Victoria, and therefore includes a living British prince who was willing to give a sample. It did not match. It was then tested against a great-nephew of Franziska Szankowska. It matched. A separate strand of her hair, found years afterwards in a book that had belonged to her husband, gave the same result. The Dowager Empress, meanwhile, the Danish princess who had come to Russia in 1866 and had been empress under one emperor and mother to the next, refused to the end of her life to accept that any of it had happened. She had been in the Crimea when the monarchy fell and had stayed there through the Civil War, declining offers of evacuation. In April of 1919, with the front approaching, her nephew, the King of England, sent a battleship for her. She refused to board it unless every Russian refugee waiting on the quay was taken as well. The captain gave way, and the ship left with a crowd of them aboard, and as it steamed out of the harbor, a passing troop ship recognized her standing on the deck, and the officers on it sang the imperial anthem across the water. She settled eventually in Denmark, in a villa outside Copenhagen. She lived there another 9 years. She never wore mourning for her sons. She never met a claimant. She never permitted a memorial service, because a memorial service would have meant conceding the fact, and she never conceded the fact. She died in October of 1928 and was buried in the Danish Royal Cathedral at Roskilde, in a country that had been hers before Russia was. In 2006, by agreement between two governments, her coffin was carried back by sea along the route she had first traveled 140 years earlier, and she was reinterred in the Fortress Cathedral in St. Petersburg beside her husband. By then, her son had been lying a few feet away for 8 years, and the manner in which he came to be there is the last part of this story. For 60 years, officially, nothing was known. The subject was not discussed. The house in Ekaterinburg stood and became an object of quiet pilgrimage. And in 1977, it was demolished on instructions from the capital on the grounds that it lacked architectural merit. But the location of what had been done afterwards was not, in fact, entirely lost. Two men had spent years working on a geologist from Ekaterinburg named Alexander Avdonin and a filmmaker named Gaily Ryabov, who had obtained access to a document written by the man who had commanded the operation and preserved by his family. In 1979, they found the place, off a cart track in a birch wood outside the city, near a road to a village called Koptiaki. They opened it, took 3 skulls, understood immediately what they were holding and what would happen to them if it were known, and put everything back. They said nothing for a decade. In 1991, with the state that had ordered the silence in the process of dissolving, the site was excavated officially. 9 sets of remains were recovered, a man of about 50, a woman of about 45, 3 young women, and 4 adults who were not related to any of them: the doctor, the valet, the cook, and the maid. 2 of the children were missing. The identification took years and was carried out by British and Russian and American laboratories, working with the earliest generation of forensic DNA methods. And it produced, by the middle of the 1990s, a conclusion that the scientific community regarded as settled. The maternal line matched the descendants of Queen Victoria. The paternal line was confirmed by exhuming a brother of the emperor, who had died young and been buried in the same cathedral. One question stayed open. Of the daughters recovered from the first grave, the scientists could not agree which one was missing. The Russian specialists concluded that it was Maria, the American specialists that it was Anastasia. It was not a trivial disagreement, because one of those names had a woman in Virginia attached to it, and the other did not. If any of you have access to the published forensic literature that settles the question definitively, leave a comment below. In July of 1998, 80 years to the day, the 9 sets of remains from the first grave were interred in a side chapel of the Fortress Cathedral in St. Petersburg, in the presence of the Russian president and of a representative of the British royal family. The Orthodox Church did not attend in the manner the state had hoped. The patriarch declined to preside. A bishop conducted the service, and the remains were buried as unidentified. 2 years later, the church canonized the family, not as martyrs for the faith, which would have required a different set of circumstances, but as passion bearers, a specifically Russian category reserved for those who meet a violent end with Christian humility. The last emperor of Russia, who had been an indifferent ruler of a country he did not understand, became a saint of the church he had governed. In the summer of 2007, a group of amateur archaeologists searching the same wood found a second, much smaller burial about 70 meters from the first. The remains in it were fragmentary and heavily damaged. DNA testing, using methods far better than those available in 1991, established with what the published papers describe as virtually irrefutable confidence that they were the 2 missing children, the boy and the sister who had not been in the first grave. They were not buried with their family. They have still not been buried with their family. The church has not accepted the identification, and the state has not proceeded without the church, and the remains of the last heir to the Russian throne and one of his sisters have spent nearly 2 decades in a state archive. In 2015, the graves in the cathedral were opened again and fresh samples taken, including from the uniform of the great-grandfather who had been assassinated in 1881, and the new tests confirmed the old ones. The dispute has continued anyway, because it was never really about the science. That is where it stands. A dynasty that began with a boy who did not want the crown ends with a boy whose bones are in a box in an archive, waiting for 2 institutions to agree about him. There is one more category of the estate to account for, and it is the largest by volume and the least portable: the buildings. They were not destroyed in the revolution. That is a common assumption, and it is wrong. The palaces around the old capital were nationalized almost at once, and then, with a speed that in retrospect seems remarkable, opened to the public as museums, partly for ideological reasons, to display the excess, and partly because the people who ran them were curators who had spent their lives in those rooms and wanted them kept. Visitors walk through the private apartments of the last emperor within a few years of his death, passed the furniture as it had been left, with the labels explaining what it had cost. What nearly destroyed them was the Second War. The front reached the outskirts of Leningrad in the autumn of 1941 and stayed there for more than 2 years. Tsarskoye Selo, Peterhof, Pavlovsk, Gatchina, the entire ring of imperial residences south of the city, lay inside the occupied zone or on the line itself. The staff evacuated what they could in the weeks before, burying statues in the parks and shipping crates east. What could not be moved was looted or burned or shelled, and the amber paneling of one famous room in the Catherine Palace was removed and taken west and has never been found. The room that visitors see today is a reconstruction completed at the beginning of this century after decades of work. By 1944, the great palaces of the Romanovs were roofless shells with trees growing in them. Photographs from that year look like the aftermath of an earthquake. They were rebuilt. It took 50 years, and it was done in a country that had lost tens of millions of people and had every reason to spend its money elsewhere. And it was done anyway, room by room, from photographs and pre-war measurements and the memories of old craftsmen, by a state that officially regarded the dynasty as a criminal enterprise. That is one of the quieter ironies in this story. The Romanovs' most valuable physical possessions were saved not by their heirs, who could not have afforded a roof between them, and not by the collectors who bought the movable pieces, but by the government that had overthrown them, which preserved the palaces as evidence, and, in preserving them, guaranteed that the family would be remembered as they had wished to be seen. And so, finally, the accounting. The Romanov fortune was never a fortune in the sense that a banking family or an industrial family would recognize. It had no diversification, no foreign holdings of any consequence, no trusts, no legal architecture designed to survive a change of regime. It was not, in the end, wealth at all in the modern sense. It was possession of land, of minerals, of buildings, of the treasury itself. And possession of that kind depends absolutely on the continued existence of the arrangement that grants it. Compare it with the industrial dynasties of the same decades. When the founders of those families died, their money was already abstract: shares, bonds, holdings in a dozen jurisdictions, structures drafted by lawyers whose entire profession consisted of imagining what might go wrong. Those fortunes were reduced by taxes and divided by heirs and thinned by 3 generations of indifferent grandchildren. And a surprising number of them are still, in some diminished form, there. The Romanovs owned 1/6 of the surface of the earth and could not carry any of it across a border. The single most valuable thing the family possessed in 1917 was not a diamond or a palace. It was a legal fiction, the proposition that one man's will was the law of 130 million people. Everything else in the inventory was downstream of that proposition, and when it stopped being believed, over the course of a single week in March, the entire estate ceased to exist as property and became immediately and permanently somebody else's. There is one more object to account for, and it is the right place to finish. At Easter in 1913, the tercentenary year, the year of the pilgrimage down the Volga, the year the family walked into the Apatiev monastery, the emperor gave his mother the most expensive thing the court jeweler had ever made for him. It is called the winter egg. It is small enough to hold in one hand. It is carved from rock crystal so thin that light passes through it, engraved on the inside with frost, and covered on the outside with platinum snowflakes, set with several thousand diamonds, each of them so tiny as to be individually worthless. It rests on a base carved to look like a block of melting ice. It opens to reveal a platinum basket of white quartz flowers rising out of gold moss, as though something had come up through the snow. It cost 24,600 rubles. A factory worker in St. Petersburg that year earned about 22 rubles a month. It was confiscated after the revolution and inventoried and sold by the state to a London dealer at a moment when the state needed foreign currency more than it needed frost. It spent most of the 20th century in British and then in private hands. It came to auction in Geneva in 1994 and set a record. It came to auction in New York in 2002 and set another. And on the 2nd of December 2025 at Christie's in London, after a bidding contest lasting about 3 minutes, it sold to an anonymous buyer for something over $30 million, the highest price ever paid at auction for any work by that house. And in real terms, a great deal more than the entire family were able to take with them when they left St. Petersburg for the last time. That is what remains of the largest fortune in Europe, an object the size of a fist, made to look like ice, changing hands in a sale room 3,000 miles from the country that paid for it. The palaces are museums. The mines belong to other people. The crown is in a vault in Moscow, and it is not going anywhere because no one has the authority to sell it and no one wants to be the person who tried. The appanage lands, the forests, the gold of the Altai, the treasury of an empire that covered a sixth of the land surface of the earth, none of it survived contact with the century in any form that a family could hold. What survived is smaller and, in the end, more durable. A photograph of 4 sisters in white dresses. A boy carried in the arms of a soldier through a monastery courtyard in a country that had 5 years left. A diary in which a man recorded the weather on the last day of 300 years, and a chapel in a fortress on an island in a cold river where the bodies were finally put back 80 years late under the names of strangers. Some fortunes, in the end, are remembered less for what they bought than for how quickly it was possible to lose all of it.